Thank you very much. Mr. Altman, good morning.
Just repeat after me, please. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God
That the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Brockington. Give us your full name, please.
Gordon Colin Brockington.
Mr. Brockington, tell us, please, first of all, what your position is with G4S.
My current role is Managing Director of Justice and the Government Chief Commercial Officer.
And since how long have you been in that role?
Since November the 9th, 2020.
You said that's your current role. How long have you worked for G4S?
I joined G4S in March 2015, and I've held a number of roles in G4S throughout that time.
So you were an employee of G4S during the period that we're interested in, April through to August 2017. Where were you at the time?
At the time, I was the Regional Business Development Director.
Head office?
Head office, correct.
Which is where?
Victoria.
And presumably you were aware, even though remote, from the allegations that arose through the Panorama recording of incidents during that period, April to August. Presumably it wasn't much of a secret at G4S. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. I was fully cited.
Yeah.
I saw the Panorama programme, and I was based in head office at the time.
Yeah. Were you on the board at the time?
I wasn't on the board, no.
No. But were you privy to any of the meetings which took place or must have taken place about what Panorama had shown?
Limited meetings.
Yeah. But clearly, directors like you would have been cited on the issues which Panorama exposed.
Not clearly. We were cited on what was, at the time, what we saw on Panorama, but a lot of the meetings that were held in relation to the Panorama were held by the project team,
Yeah.
were held by the senior execs at the time and the operations team responsible for the Gatwick IRC.
When you talk about a project team, was a team especially set up in order to deal with the matter?
Absolutely. The immediate actions and the action plan were compiled by a specific project team immediately after Panorama, amongst other things, which we took immediate action on.
Who headed the team? Do you remember now?
I believe initial investigations were taken place by Lee Hanford and Pete Small,
Yeah.
and then the project team was put together to develop the actions required in collaboration with the Home Office and others.
Yeah.
And then the action plan was then put in place and deployed.
Who did the project team report to on the board?
I believe that would have been Jerry Petherick at the time.
But he left, didn't he?
Jerry Petherick?
Yeah, didn't he leave G4S?
He did,
Yeah.
but not at the time, not immediately post Panorama.
Well, we'll look at a document in a moment, and I'll ask you about it then. Your paragraph 77 of your first witness statement, of which you make two, and we'll come to that in a second. I'll ask the chair if we can adduce both the statements. They are respectively CJS 0074041 and CJS 0074043, and you'll confirm you made two witness statements to the inquiry, Mr. Brockington. The first on the 10th of the 7th of February of this year, I think, and the second on the 10th of February. Is that correct?
I can confirm that's correct, yeah.
Yeah. And let's look at what you say at paragraph 77 of your first witness statement. We don't have to put it up on screen. But you say, following the broadcast, the company sent a clear message to all employees that the behaviours witnessed in the programme were unacceptable and would not be tolerated. The message was reinforced by the swift suspensions that followed, together with the subsequent investigations and cooperation and engagement with Sussex Police. So that was the message the company sent out, yes?
That is correct. That came from Peter Needham.
came from
Peter Needham.
Peter Needham.
That's where I saw it from
Yeah.
in an email from Peter Needham.
Did G4S, as you understand it, accept all of the Lampard findings and recommendations? The Verita?
We did. So of the 52 recommendations, in the Verita report, clearly that came sometime after.
Yeah, that was,
so,
the final report was November the
absolutely.
following year.
Yeah, so we broadly accepted the 52 recommendations, that is correct.
Well, when you say broadly, what does that mean?
In essence, we accepted the 52
Yeah.
findings when it came out in the final report sometime after, of course, I believe it'd be late in December 2018.
Yes. Let's look at a document. It's dated the 10th of January 2019. It's one which has been disclosed to you, so I hope you've had an opportunity to look at it. HOM 005917, Chair, it's tab 30 for you, sorry. And this is a Home Office document headed Shore Programme Board, 10th of January 2019, and it is in relation to the Verita report on Brookhouse. And at the bottom it gives a summary of it. We don't need to go through that. Over the page, under recommendations, it tells us that there are 52 recommendations under 7 broad headings. G4S have recently shared their internal response attached at Annex A, although it's not attached to the document in your bundle, indicating that they have accepted all of the recommendations. They're showing 40 as having been completed, with the other 12 either in progress or under consideration. At face value, their response appears appropriate, although lacking in dates for actions that remain outstanding. And there is some further text there. So first of all, the Home Office's understanding, and this is a document, if we look to the bottom of the next page, is under the authorship of Phil Riley, who we will be hearing from next week, and it's dated the 2nd of January 2019. But clearly the Home Office's understanding is that the 52 recommendations under the 7 broad headings had been accepted by G4S without qualification. Do you accept that?
I think in my previous statement I said G4S accepted the recommendations of the Verita report.
Yeah. Well, it was your word broadly, which I was asking you about. If we go back to page, if we're still on page 2, do you see the large paragraph in the centre there, and just below? Towards the end of it, with the announced departures of Peter Needham, Jerry Petherick and Paul Kempster, G4S will have replaced the entire management chain, who may be regarded as having presided over the Panorama events. Now, this document is dated, as I remind you, January 2019. Jerry Petherick, had he remained in post to help with the post-Panorama fallout, or had he gone fairly quickly? Do you remember?
Jerry was in post Panorama, absolutely.
No, but how long did he remain?
I'm not sure of his exact departure date, but he was certainly in post for a period after Panorama.
Yeah. And with all of this in mind, Mr. Brockington, can we look at your witness statement at paragraph 62, your first witness statement? And perhaps we ought to start at paragraph 61. Let's put this up on screen. CJS 00740441 at page 15. Right at the top, the Verita report noted that they had, and you quote here, cause to question the quality and content of some of the training offered to new recruits on the ITC and to staff as refresher training. We found that not all those delivering the ITC and refresher courses were appropriately qualified, and that's a reference to paragraph 1.38 in the Verita report. And you say at 62, the company doesn't accept this conclusion. Why not?
So in relation to training, I I think it's quite important to lay out the training protocols that we have in place at the IRC. The ITC, the initial training course, the contents were actually quite helpfully laid out in the Shaw report of 2018. I believe it's section 6, where it lays out the contents of what we agreed collaboratively and mutually with the Home Office in terms of the content of the training of the ITC. So I think with specific reference to the ITC, we worked with our customer to devise and deploy the ITC in order for all frontline officers to receive their certification aligned with being a fit and proper person. So they were certified by the Secretary of State to be a frontline officer. So in our view, the ITC was devised and deployed collaboratively in accordance with our Home Office customer, and the training was fit for purpose.
Let's look at the Verita report, please. CJS 005923. Page 36, Zainab, when you get there, please. What I'm struggling to understand, Mr. Brockington, in light of what you said in your witness statement, is why then the company accepted recommendation 9, and we'll come to it in a second, recommendation 40. Recommendation 9, the SMT and G4S managers should undertake regular and systematic evaluation and quality assurance of the training provided at Gatwick IRCs to ensure that staff receive training of a consistently high standard, that it meets the operational needs of the IRCs, trains and develops staff appropriately and promotes appropriate values. So when Verita had cause to question the quality and content of some of the training, there's a recommendation that deals with it. In your witness statement, you say the company doesn't accept the conclusion, but it accepted the recommendation. How does that work?
I think it's a sign of a healthy business that we would consistently review our training requirements. I take some comfort, although we have our own governance in place, I take some comfort that the HMIP inspection of 2019 showed that we had improved training in place. I would also say that the Stephen Shaw findings of 2016, one of the recommendations said that we should deliver mandatory safer training on an annual basis, and we included that into our annual training. We also deployed annual refresher training in areas such as CNR, first aid, respiratory protective equipment, equality and diversity, to name a few examples. So my personal view is I see this as a sign of a healthy business that we consistently review our training. We deploy our training, the initial training course, as explained in the Shaw report, in full sight of the customer, working with the customer to make sure the training is fit for purpose, and then we deploy ongoing training on an annual basis in certain areas as well. So that is where I conclude my position in the statement.
Well, let's look on to recommendation 40 on page 37, because this deals with the second criticism, which you say the company doesn't accept. Recommendation 40, the SMT in consultation with the local safeguarding boards must ensure that all staff receive appropriate annual safeguarding refresher training. And that was accepted without qualification by the company. So again, one struggles to understand why at paragraph 62 you say the company didn't accept the conclusion that Verita arrived at. It's the same points, isn't it?
So with specific reference to safeguarding, the Stephen Shaw report of 2016 stated clearly that that we needed to act. The 2016 HMIP inspection in relation to the Stephen Shaw report stated we needed to act and we needed effective training for adults at risk, and that was incorporated into the Consolidated Action Plan of 2016, and the HMIP inspection of 2019 showed improvements, and that was also reflected in the Shaw report. We worked closely with the West Sussex Social Services Vulnerable Adults Board, and working with them we developed annual refresher training. So again, I think it's a sign of a healthy business where we consistently review based on external feedback, and we adapt and change in accordance with that feedback that we've received. So again, that is where I conclude this position in my statement.
The trouble is, Mr. Brockington, that doesn't really answer the question. My question is, and I know you are the mouthpiece for the company, and you're here to answer questions on behalf of the company, and you weren't directly involved in these matters, as you made clear at the time. But here is the company accepting recommendations in the Verita report, and I've pointed out so far two in particular. The Home Office clearly understood by January 2019 that G4S had not only accepted all of the recommendations without qualification, but was actioning them. And here you are in 2022 saying the company doesn't accept the positions which I just put to you. And I think people will struggle to understand, although we hear your answer, that the company listens to feedback and it does all of these things, all fine and terrific, Mr. Brockington. But there seems to be, in the passage I've read so far, and I'll come to another in a moment, a resistance by G4S to accept what it accepted back in November 2018 or afterwards, once it received the final Verita report.
So
Do you understand what I'm saying?
I do understand what you're saying, but I disagree with G4S's approach around the resistance. The level of activity taken post-Panorama, and we have to look at this in terms of a time frame. The Panorama programme was viewed by us all, and the immediate action plan was taken in, was put in place and deployed. And those actions took immediate effect, and I can talk about those actions at some length. But we took a number of management interventions immediately, including the bringing in a new interim director, including increasing DCOs from 2 to 3 on the wings, including increasing the DCMs on the wings, bolstering the SMT, and improving the fabric of the establishment. So we took a number of significant management interventions immediately as part of the Panorama action plan. Those then, as part of a further action of the Panorama action plan, was to work with Verita. But Verita took a period to compile their report and then put out their recommendations. So we have to look at this in the context of the timeline. A number of those actions were already completed by the time that Verita issued their report. So that is why, come January 19, 40 of the recommendations had already been completed, and 12 are outstanding, of which I believe broadly five were dependent on work the Home Office and ourselves needed to do together. So that is our position. But there was I categorically say there's absolutely no resistance from G4S as a business to deliver what was needed to be done.
I'm just wondering, Mr. Brockington, why it wouldn't have been easier for you to have said that in your witness statement rather than saying the company doesn't accept the conclusions?
If that was an oversight, so that is my position, that is the evidence that I'm giving the inquiry to do.
Well, it's not the only one, because if we look at your witness statement, your first witness statement at 98, for example, if we can put that up, please, CJS 00740441. At page 22, you then say at the top, paragraph 97, the Verita report also concluded the lack of visible, supportive managers' heavy-handed approach to performance issues and a lack of confidence in the arrangements for reporting and dealing with concerns has meant staff have tended to rely on each other for support and guidance. These management shortcomings have discouraged staff from raising concerns, including those about the behaviour of colleagues and managers. And at 98, you say the company doesn't fully accept these conclusions. DCMs were constantly on the floor, although prior to the reprofiling mentioned above, and it's something you deal with in the statement, reprofiling of staff, they would have covered 2 residential wings, so wouldn't have been visible to all staff all of the time. What was it you didn't fully accept?
I think the actions we took immediately post-Panorama, as I've just described to the inquiry, is we brought in a new interim director. The interim director was very clear in his views that we needed to increase the number of DCOs on the floor from 2 to 3 and DCMs to 1 per wing, amongst other things, some of which I've just previously described. So there is a recognition in our action plan that there was a requirement to bolster both the DCO and DCM resource within the establishment. And I think it's quite important to add that G4S took that action and cost for the period up to the extension. That then translated that profile then translated into the 2-year extension, which we delivered, and that also translated into the new tender in 2020, which is now being delivered by the new provider.
Serco.
Indeed.
Well, let's look at what you say at 99. The company doesn't fully accept the conclusions for the reasons given earlier. A key point is that just because senior managers, SMT, were not visible all of the time didn't take away the fact they were present. Notwithstanding, as already explained, the company does accept the senior managers could have been more visible, but it doesn't accept that any lack of visibility or actions discourage staff from reporting concerns. The Verita report doesn't fully set out the reasons as to why it reached this view, and the company wasn't involved in the investigation, nor does it have knowledge or access to the underlying source material in order to understand or consider the point further. Who commissioned the Verita report?
We commissioned the Verita report.
And if we look at their first recommendation, we go back to the report, please, Zainab, CJS 005923, at page 34. Right at the bottom, the SMT should be more present in the centre and should consider how they can better engage with staff to be completed as a matter of urgency. Again, G4S accepted this recommendation, yet here we have 3 paragraphs with you on behalf of the company seeking to undermine some of it. So, how do you explain that?
So we're not undermining that at all from my perspective. I think we've been very clear in the fairly decisive actions that we took post-Panorama, that we recognised there was a gap between the senior management team on site and the DCMs on site. What I would say is to address that point under the leadership and direction of the new interim director. We bolstered the SMT, we increased the DCMs, but we also engaged Corndell, which is a training provider, to increase the skills of the DCMs to create, to ensure they had the right skills to be frontline managers, and also to develop a career path for those DCMs. So what I'm saying through my response is we took a number of actions to address the findings, and we took that, as it said, as a matter of urgency. That was one of the initial actions which we took as part of our action plan post-Panorama.
Well, I was going to ask you because, the Verita report, which was commissioned, let's not forget, and I've reminded you, and you've agreed, was commissioned by G4S, your company. And here it is in Recommendation 1 in its final report of November 2018 saying to be completed as a matter of urgency. Doesn't that suggest to you that it hadn't been done?
No.
It doesn't?
No. So what I tried to explain earlier, perhaps clumsily, was there was a timeline of activity between Panorama and the issuing of the Verita recommendations. The Panorama episode was shown. There was a an action group, a project group, which was put in place to develop an action plan. The action plan was deployed, and a significant number of management interventions, working collaboratively with our customer, working collaboratively with the Home Office at the time, were deployed. As one of those actions, the Verita report was commissioned, and the findings were subsequently released in December 2018, some 14, 15 months after the viewing of the programme. A number of those actions had been completed, and as you saw in your previous document, which you just showed, which was the Shaw Programme Board of 10th of January, 40 of the 52 recommendations had been completed by that stage. So we had done a lot of this stuff.
Did G4S have any input to this final report before it went out, before it was published? In other words, did Kate Lampard and Ed Marsden send it to G4S to say, do you have any comments on the final draft before it's published?
My only understanding of any intervention which we had was, I believe there was a slight redaction due to GDPR before G4S agreed to publish this document, publish it, and I have to say we agreed to publish it in full, subject to certain GDPR redactions.
Don't you find it a little odd, if we go through all these reductions, these recommendations, forgive me, that timelines are given to be completed as a matter of urgency? We see recommendation 32 to be completed within 6 months. But if some of these had already been completed in the action plan that you've been telling us about, then why did the report go out like this, with a series of recommendations, with timelines and deadlines, which weren't required because these had been completed? Can you understand that?
I can understand the question. What I come back to is it was an independent report, albeit commissioned by ourselves, and there's a lot of activity that happened between Panorama and Verita conducting their review, which took a period of time, compiling their report and issuing their recommendations. So, and as a business, we got on and did a lot of the actions that we were required to do, and which we put in place as part of the initial Panorama action plan. So I think it's, we have to look at this in terms of the timeline. We have to look at this in terms of, at a moment in time, and when the actions or the recommendations for the Verita report were subsequently issued in December 2018, as I said, and clearly the Shaw Programme Board review of the 10th of January 2019 clearly states that we had completed, and it was agreed we'd completed 40 of the 52 recommendations.
But that was January 2019.
Which is after which is some more month after the recommendation.
Yeah, I accept that. It was 2 or 3 months after at least the date of this report, which is November 2018. Let's turn then to a different matter, please. Back to your witness statement, please, at paragraph 6. We don't need to put it up on screen, but do you agree, Mr. Brockington, under the heading, the Panorama Programme, it says, I do not believe the company is in a position to comment or speculate on what the cause or causes of behaviour of the staff shown in the programme was or were. And then you go on to express the company's views that what they did was inconsistent with the company's values, that the behaviours had never been condoned and were not the behaviours expected of staff, which was to act at all times with integrity, professionalism, and in accordance with trained and accepted practices. And you say, given that I have no personal knowledge as to any matters raised by Panorama or know any of the individuals identified, I don't feel that I can comment further on why they behaved in the way that they did. You agree you said that?
I believe that's from my statement, yes.
And so if we go on to paragraph 34, please, I just want to ask you why you said this, and it's on your page 9. The company doesn't believe that either staffing levels or turnover were a factor in the mistreatment of detainees between April and August 2017. I mean, that's a speculation which you weren't prepared to speculate about, and I'm just wondering why you afforded yourself the luxury of doing so at paragraph 34, having said that you weren't prepared to.
So I think I'd like to just go back to your previous comments in terms of the Panorama programme. And I want to go slightly further than what I put in the initial statement in terms of what we witnessed in the Panorama programme and the actions of an isolated number of individuals was abhorrent. There was absolutely no place for that in society in general, let alone working for G4S. So I do want to go a little bit further than I said in my statement. However, coming to your second point, I don't believe there's a direct correlation between the turnover of staff, profit, I think you stated, and the isolated instance of individuals acting wholly, and I maintain wholly inappropriately. Individuals are trained, the frontline staff, all the frontline staff are trained through the initial training course, the ITC programme, which I explained earlier is helpfully laid out in the Shaw report in section 6, the detail of which is very visible, and we work collaboratively with the Home Office on the contents of that. That then allows, through the fit and proper persons process and the initial training, allows the individuals to get a certification and become frontline officers. So I think we train the individuals to do what they do, and these individuals chose to act in the way that they did. So I see no correlation between staff turnover and profit.
Paragraph 36, you say, to be clear, the company accepts that staffing levels and turnover at Brookhouse was an issue during the relevant period. The reasons for that were multifactorial, and whilst it's accepted that they had an adverse impact on the centre and the regime, those are entirely separate and unrelated when it comes to the question of abuses. How do you know that?
I've clearly spoken to a lot of colleagues in preparation for this hearing. I think we recognise, and I say in my statement, we're very clear that the design of the establishment in relation to activities, it wasn't designed for a significant amount of activities, and I think the turnover, this is an area where I'm not an expert, but I would say that certain activities, the whole process wasn't designed for a lot of activities at that time.
Now, you're not an expert, but Professor Mary Bosworth is.
Agreed.
And we heard from her 2 days ago. Did you read her evidence or watch her evidence?
I saw some of it, yes.
Which part did you see?
The first part.
The first part?
Yeah.
During which, presumably you've read her report?
I haven't read her report.
You haven't
no.
read her report?
No.
Why not?
To be honest, I just haven't read her report.
Well, it's critical, isn't it? I mean, she is one of 3 experts who have provided lengthy accounts to the inquiry within their fields of expertise, in her case, culture and staff culture. She wrote, you've referred to the Shaw report. She was responsible for Annex 5 in the January 2016 report of Stephen Shaw, and she also wrote a literature review at Annexes 10 and 11. In the Shaw report of July 2018, she's an expert in the field. She's been involved in this environment for many years and is a well-respected expert. And at length, not only did she write in both reports her views of staff culture and the impact of the environment, the physical environment, the fact which is unavoidable, that detainees were being held in Brookhouse far longer than the place was designed for or its purpose. And she had no doubt in telling us that among the many things which were causative or contributory to the mistreatment of the detainees in that place during the relevant period in particular were staffing levels, the turnover, retention, recruitment. All of those issues were part of the melting pot, to use your word, multi-factors, which you can't divorce from the abuse of those detainees within Brookhouse. Now, why didn't you know that?
I hadn't read the report, so...
Well, you should have done, shouldn't you, Mr. Brockington?
We work very closely with academia across our broader estate. Perhaps I should have read the report.
Perhaps.
I haven't read the report.
No, well, clearly not. But you watched part of her evidence. Watched or read?
I watched a small part.
Yeah, a small part. So she is one, as I say, of three experts who has told us that really just the whole environment, the whole effect and impact, not only on the detainees but staff, caused or contributed to what we're all here for now. Are you prepared to accept that?
Sorry, can I...
Are you prepared to accept her evidence?
What I say in my report is I don't believe there is a direct correlation between a isolated instance of abhorrent abuse and the overarching environment.
She's an expert and says that there is. You're not an expert, and you say there isn't. Who do you think the inquiry should listen to?
That's for the inquiry to decide. My view is these were isolated incidents of dreadful behaviour that is contrary to the training which GFRES provided, is contrary to the certification obligations to the Secretary of State in order for their certification. So I believe they are. My personal view is I don't believe there's a correlation. I think that these isolated instances of abuse are isolated.
If we go back to your paragraph 34, let's, Zainab, put it back up on screen. CJS 00744041, page 9. It's the second part of that paragraph. The company's view is that regardless of the number of staff on site, the small number of individuals concerned chose to conduct themselves as they did when they thought they were effectively acting out of sight. If they were that way inclined, they would likely have behaved in such circumstances irrespective as to the overall staffing profile or numbers. Now, out of sight of whom, Mr. Brockington?
Out of sight of, I'm guessing, cameras or senior management.
So eyesight and earshot, presumably? Because it's not just physical abuse, it's language. Derogatory, offensive, verbally abusive language. You know that?
Yes.
Yeah. And out of sight of who in particular?
As I said, out of sight of senior management and cameras.
Well, out of sight of the SMT, yes?
Sorry, that's what I thought I just said, yeah.
Well, no, you said managers. What do you mean by
senior
managers?
management team.
Senior management team.
Yeah.
Jerry Petherick, who was at Brookhouse presumably from time to time?
He was at time to time. I think in his evidence, he said that he was there. He tried to get to all of his sites monthly.
Yeah, it wasn't out of sight of other detainees. It wasn't out of sight of other officers, because it was often committed in front of other officers, DCOs and DCMs, and it wasn't out of sight of Callum Tully, because he was able to record it all from the 24th of April 2017 until he left in early July. What do you mean by the small number of individuals concerned? What do you regard as a small number of individuals?
We witnessed on the Panorama programme a number of individuals who conducted themselves wholly inappropriately. And I put that in the context of the many, many, many thousands of hours that colleagues within my business deliver. We're a private, you've heard from previous individuals giving evidence to the inquiry, we're a private sector company delivering public services. We deliver many, many, many thousands of hours of public service to care for those individuals in our care. So when I talk about a small number, I put it in the context of, thousands of colleagues on a day-to-day, hour-by-hour basis delivering care to those in our care. So that is what I mean. We witnessed a handful of people delivering abhorrent activities.
Well, that may be right as far as the Panorama broadcast is concerned. I assume you have watched that, haven't you?
I watched it live at the time, and I've watched it many times since.
Yeah. And have you watched any of the undisclosed, unbroadcast footage?
Not much of it, no.
How much?
Very minimal amounts.
Well, what does that mean?
Well, a couple of snippets, really. Not
A couple
really
of
not very
snippets. Have you looked at some of the material disclosed by your own company?
Yes, I have.
CCTV and handheld and body-worn camera footage?
I've seen some of it, not a huge amount.
No. Have you read some of the transcripts?
I have.
How many?
I couldn't say.
No. You see, just if one reads that paragraph, the company's view is that regardless of the number of staff on site, the small number of individuals concerned chose to conduct themselves as they did when they thought they were effectively acting out of sight. If they were that way inclined, they would likely have behaved in such circumstances irrespective as to the overall staffing profile or numbers. It just sounds a little trivialising, Mr. Brockington. Presumably you don't mean that.
I wholly disagree with us trivialising this issue. This is a material issue, and we have taken it as an organisation incredibly seriously. The immediate actions that we took post Panorama, working with Sussex and West Sussex Police, working with the Home Office, working with the IMB, developing the action plan, delivering a number of management actions immediately and further actions ongoing. I don't for 1 minute see how you can conclude that we've taken it trivially. This is an incredibly important issue for us as an organisation, and we've taken it very, very seriously indeed.
I mean, the words out of sight are intended to suggest that the company, the senior management, never knew what was going on. Is that the intention behind the wording?
There's not an intention behind the wording. I do agree with you that the senior management team weren't cited on these issues, otherwise they would have acted accordingly.
They've been going on since at least 2014. I know you tell us you didn't join the company until 2015, and you haven't been in the position you're in before November 2020. But were you aware that the mistreatment of detainees had been notified to the SMT as early as 2014? Were you aware of that?
I wasn't aware of that. What I would say is, in terms of sort of constant failings, HMIP inspection of 2019 did state that they had no evidence to suggest that there was the 2016 inspection they'd missed any issues which were raised in Panorama. So whilst I don't take sole acceptance from HMIP, what I do take is a degree of assurance from an independent inspection such as HMIP.
Yeah, but Mr. Brockington, we all know that an unannounced inspection of HMIP is not necessarily going to provide the sort of information that was internally available to SMT members as early as 2014. You're talking about 2019. You refer back to the the relevant report that covers the 2016 period. But we're not really interested in that, Mr. Brompton. What we are interested in is what G4S knew, and that's why you're here. Have you heard the name Stacey Dean?
I have.
Yeah. So you will know that Stacey Dean, in fact, together with Michelle Brown, but Stacey Dean in particular, first complained of the mistreatment of detainees sometime before October 2014. And you should know that because of that, Jerry Petherick became involved eventually. I'm not going to go through the whole history. Some of it's been ventilated during the course of the inquiry evidence, but she made a witness statement to the inquiry fairly recently. We can put it up on screen, Zaina, please. INQ 000172 at page 2, tab 31, Chair. Paragraph 6. I've been asked whether I raised concern about the treatment of detainees earlier than October 2014. I can't recall when I first raised concern about the treatment of detainees formally. I know I raised the matter along with the culture of staff bullying in various meetings, as did other members of the SMT. I've been asked whether I have any further in relation to the complaint I made in 2015, and recall that regarding DCOs Instone, Brewer and Fagbo, I raised concern that it was a well-discussed issue at senior meetings, that assurances had been given they would not be allowed to work together on the same wing, and that they were bullying detainees, yet whenever I went to Brookhouse, they were always rostered together. Other than that, I have nothing further to raise on that point. And at paragraph 8 on the next page, she says both myself and Miss Brown, if we just perhaps start at the beginning, I've been asked to respond to the point that Miss Brown raised concern at an SMT meeting at which I was present. I do recall regularly that Ms. Brown was one of the SMT members who repeatedly raised concern about staff treatment of detainees. Both myself and Ms. Brown were concerned that some members of staff, as well as detainees, were being regularly subjected to bullying behaviour from some staff. The response of the SMT was consistently uninterested. I don't recall specific dates or times, but do remember the general approach to any of us raising concern or complaint would be fairly generic and non-committal, and the lack of any action was frustrating. At times, I think the view from some SMT members was that the situation was amusing, so it was far from taken seriously. And we know that she wrote an email dated the 25th of October 2015, both to Steve Skitt, who was the Deputy Director, and Ben Saunders, who was the Centre Director, making similar complaints. And her complaints in particular about mistreatment in relation to Instone Brewer and Fagbo was goading and antagonising detainees. And so it starts as early as around 2014, certainly by 2015. Jerry Petherick was involved. So it's hard to say that the company didn't know, or individuals higher up the ladder didn't know. Don't you agree? I mean, this is a precursor to what we see in 2017.
I really can't comment further on these. I'm afraid I have nothing further to add on the evidence which you've just put in front of me.
If we go to another statement, Nathan Ward, that's a name that will be familiar to you, I suspect, Mr. Brockington.
I don't know Nathan, but I do know the name.
Yeah. DL 0000154, please, at page 2. This is his second statement made to the inquiry. Paragraph 5. And he begins that paragraph by saying, having reviewed the investigation. Are you aware of the Cotter investigation?
I know of its existence. I know nothing of its detail.
Stephen Cotter was asked to investigate any number of issues and grievances which arose between members of staff following Nathan Ward's, not only his exit interview, but as a result of, and he left in about 2014, but as a result of any number of other grievances. And in particular, what he had to say to the Panorama programme. And Stephen Cotter wrote a lengthy report. It's dated the 16th of November 2017. And that's the investigation Nathan Ward is here talking about. Having reviewed the investigation, I believe the most important point to take away from it is that it shows in the years building up to the abuse captured by Panorama, various complaints of bullying, mismanagement and failures at Brookhouse were made directly to Jerry Petherick, but these repeated complaints, whether by myself, Wayne Debnam, Stacey Dean or Michelle Brown, with the latter two in particular raising concerns about staff treatment of detainees, clearly didn't result in any sufficient changes being made by the time of the relevant period in 2017. This can be the only conclusion on any viewing of Panorama and the wider footage that has been provided by the BBC on the way staff treated detainees. The fact that officers such as Instone Brewer and Fagbo, two officers accused not just of mistreating detainees, but in fact also dealing spice, was still in place by the relevant period is damning. Stacey Dean had raised concerns about these officers to Ben Saunders and Stephen Skit as early as 2015. That's the email I referred to a moment or two ago. Do you agree it's damning, Mr. Brockington?
I can't conclude either way. I have nothing more to add.
Well, why not? You're the face of G4S. Why have you got nothing more to add?
I have no corporate memory or knowledge of these specific issues, so it would be inappropriate for me to add anything further.
Do you need corporate memory to apologise, for example, to say that this should never have happened, to say that the company knew that there were issues as long ago as 2014, 2015, and there is a causative link?
In relation to the specific Panorama programme, of course, I'm exceptionally sorry. I thought I was pretty clear in my view a few moments ago when I said that the actions which we witnessed in Panorama were quite frankly disgusting. And as an organisation and as an individual managing director I take full responsibility for the actions of my business, I'm exceptionally sorry that those actions took place. But on the specifics of the emails and the detail of which you've just put in front of me, I don't have anything further to add. What I reiterate is I was appalled by what I saw in Panorama, and of course, as an organisation, we're exceptionally sorry that happened.
Can we look at your paragraph 71 of your witness statement? Back to CJS 0074041 at page 16. Under the heading Management of Brookhouse, you say the company doesn't believe that members of the senior management team at Brookhouse were aware of mistreatment of detainees of the type shown in Panorama. What type did you have in mind? What was the qualification of the type? What did you mean by that?
We're literally just referring to the appalling behaviour that we saw in Panorama programme.
Because it's clear from what I've just suggested to you that management was aware years before that detainees were being mistreated. You accept that, don't you?
No, what I responded to your question was I can't conclude either way.
Or you're just not prepared to, Mr. Brockington?
No, I said, as I said, I can't conclude either way.
And then at 72, at the top of the next page, the company is not aware of any evidence to suggest that senior managers ought to have been aware of such mistreatment. Did you really mean that?
But I would say that if senior managers were made aware of mistreatment, they would have acted appropriately. I can certainly refer to the business which I run today, and I would fully expect that if any evidence of any suggestions of mistreatment occurred within the establishments which I run, we would absolutely take immediate action to to investigate.
Well, let's look at what the company did know. You've referred to the HMIP report for signed off by Peter Clark in January 2017, but for the inspection window of the 31st of October to the 11th of November 2016, CJS 000761, please. Page 1 to begin with. And this is one of the reports you've referred to, Mr. Brockington, isn't it? And if we then go to page 20, were you aware that the HMIP conducted a detainee survey?
I was aware, yes.
Yep. And if we look at 1.13 on page 20, in our survey, 37% of detainees reported feeling unsafe, 21% reported victimisation by other detainees, and 18% by staff. The Safer Community team had provided information in different languages to detainees about reporting concerns. Focus groups had been held to discuss victimisation and violence. And then if we go to page 69, at the top, it's Appendix 4, Summary of Detainee Survey Responses. And at the foot of the page, under the heading Survey Response, at the time of the survey, on the 31st of October 2016, the detainee population at Brookhouse was 392. And using the methodology they set out, questionnaires were distributed to a sample of 209 detainees. We received a total of 159 completed questionnaires, a response rate of 76%. This included one questionnaire completed via interview, 9 respondents refused to complete a questionnaire, and 41 questionnaires were not returned. Can we go on, please, to 76, page 76. And here you will see the questions and the responses which the HMIP received in the course of their detainee survey. And in particular on page 76, we have under section 7, towards the bottom, beginning with question 43, do you have a member of staff at the centre you can turn to for help if you have a problem? And so on. There are 4 questions in that vein, concluding at question 46 at the top of the next page. And then a new section, section 8, safety. Do you feel unsafe in this section? Question 47, yes, 37%, no, 63%, 48. Has another detainee or group of detainees victimised, insulted or assaulted you here? Yes, 21%, no, 79%. Question 49, further questions about victimisation by detainees or groups of detainees. But let's look at question 50. Has a member of staff or group of staff victimised, in brackets, victimised here meaning insulted or assaulted, you here? Yes, 18%, no, 82%, 51. If you have felt victimised by a member of staff or a group of staff, what did the incident or incidents involve? Physical abuse, being hit, kicked or assaulted, 3%. 52. If you've been victimised by detainees or staff, did you report it? Yes, 12%. And skating over 53, question 54, have you ever felt threatened or intimidated by a member of staff in here? Yes, 12%. Now, presumably, senior managers, not just at SMT level, but at board level, would be privy to the contents of a report like this.
I would absolutely agree. I can't speak for my colleagues. What I would say, in the business and the state which I run, when we have an HMIP inspection, I would certainly read the contents of an HMIP inspection.
Well, this one, as I've told you, was signed off by Peter Clark, the Chief Inspector, in January 2017, so a matter of 3 months before the commencement of the relevant period for the purposes of this inquiry. Why doesn't a survey like this ring alarm bells? Because here it is, writ large, that there are detainees who were prepared to take part in this survey and prepared to tell HMIP that they were being insulted or assaulted, in particular physically abused, being hit, kicked or assaulted, and it had been reported. Now, you can't tell this inquiry, Mr. Brockington, that the company didn't know that there were problems, can you?
What I would say is the findings of Peter Clark and his inspection team stated very clearly that the 2016 report issued in 2017, the establishment was allocated a reasonably good overall assessment for the 4 healthy establishment tests. So, whilst I agree there are specifics in there which would have formed part of the action plan, the overall assessment was reasonably good. I would also go back to and refer you to the 2019 report, which is clearly after the second inspection, where HMIP also stated there was no evidence to suggest in the 2016 inspection that they had missed any issues relating to what was subsequently seen in the Panorama.
So the company takes comfort from 2 words, reasonably good, but is what, prepared to excuse as acceptable the physical abuse even of 3% of the detainee population?
Sorry, that's not what I said.
No. So what are you saying, Mr. Brockington? Because it seems to me, and it may seem to others, that you're sidestepping the issue. You're relying on what Peter Clark said or what HMIP said overall about the health of the establishment, but are overlooking this detainee survey.
That's not the case when we receive, and I can only talk for today, when we receive an HMIP inspection final report, we would review it in detail, and that forms the basis of an overarching action plan to constantly improve our establishments, because that's what we do, and we strive to improve constantly. This would have formed part of our thinking, undoubtedly, at the time. So I'm not sidestepping it based on 2 words. What I'm actually saying is we hold HMIP inspections very, very seriously. They are absolute experts in their field who have a full appreciation of both the custodial and the detained estate, who periodically come and assess us overall. So we do take what they say incredibly seriously. We also take what the detainees say incredibly seriously. And this would form part of our overarching action plan. But I go back to the point that whilst we and HMIP will have looked at this data very closely, the overarching assessment of our establishment was reasonably good.
I assume you'll agree, Mr. Brockington, that these figures are unacceptable.
I would agree that when we review these, we need to take action. Any form of violence that is of staff against detainee or prisoner is wholly, that falls outside of the formal training and process, is wholly unacceptable.
And you made that clear that under your tenure, if you heard of that sort of thing happening, you would deal with it. You said that earlier.
I would, and I stand by that.
Yeah. What was done about this? Forget HMIP and forget, if I may say so, seeking refuge in the fact that Peter Clark found the establishment reasonably good. What I want to know is what was done about even unacceptable figures of physical abuse of detainees, which was reported. What was done about it at the time?
I'm afraid I wasn't privy to the specifics at the time, so I can't comment further on that specific question.
No. Well, what I am going to do, Mr. Brockington, is to invite you, after you've completed your evidence, to find out and provide, if you would, a further statement to the inquiry, please, telling us exactly what G4S did about the information in this detainee survey from 2017.
We would be delighted to do that.
Going back to your witness statement, if we may, please. At paragraph 21. You say, in terms of lessons learned, at paragraph 21, page 5, Zaya. In terms of lessons learned, the company would accept that the management team in place at the time spent a significant amount of their time dealing with paperwork, leaving insufficient time to be proactive and be out and about in the centre. This changed following the Panorama programme and the implementation of the Project Board Action Plan. At 22, you say managers were not close enough to the day-to-day goings-on, which led to individuals taking too much direction from DCMs. Now, are you accepting, so that we're clear, that there were failures at senior management level at the time?
What I'm saying is there was, after Panorama, when we brought in an experienced interim director into the establishment, it was clear that there was a disconnect between the SMT and the DCMs on site. I think I mentioned earlier, but I will reiterate, as part of the action plan, under the leadership of the new interim director, we bolstered the SMT, we increased the number of DCMs, and we deployed training to the DCMs through engagement with Corndell to ensure they had the required training to deliver their role. So we would accept, and I say in my statement, that there was a disconnect between the SMT and the frontline management.
Yeah. So coming back to my original question, are you prepared to accept that there were failures at senior management level at the time?
What I'm saying is that there was a disconnect between the two.
Well, why won't you agree with me, Mr. Brockington? Why are you not prepared to agree with the word failure?
What I'm saying is the senior management team were clearly focused in one area. There was, as I said previously, there was clearly a disconnect which was highlighted by the new interim director, and we took appropriate actions to close that gap.
So are you saying it wasn't a failure?
I'm saying there was clearly a gap between the frontline management and the senior management team.
So it's a disconnect, it's a gap, but the word failure you can't bring to say. Is that it, Mr. Brockington? You're not prepared to characterise it as a failure?
I stand by what I've just said.
You go on to say at paragraph 22, there was a perception that this environment bred bad habits and common practices developed which were not acceptable. Whose perception did you have in mind?
That would be the perception of the frontline staff.
By which you mean?
DCOs.
So the DCOs perceived that the environment bred bad habits and common practices developed which were not acceptable. How did they breed bad habits? How did the DCOs breed bad habits, or are you saying the senior management bred bad habits?
I'm afraid yeah, had no sight of what was happening on site at that time.
Mr. Brockington, these are your words.
Yeah.
They're not my words. I'm just reading back to you what you were prepared to sign off as a statement of truth. So help us. Why did you say this? What was the perception that the environment bred bad habits? That's what I want to know. These are your words. What did you mean?
I think this is just a general feeling, is my understanding from the work that I've done and talking to colleagues, is my understanding that there was as I say, there was a disconnect between DCMs and the SMT on site, and that was picked up by the staff on site.
And who are the colleagues that you spoke to in order to produce these words in this paragraph of this statement? Who did you speak to? Who's your information from?
I've spoken to a number of people within the organisation.
Yeah. People who were at Brookhouse at the time?
People had an understanding of Brookhouse.
People who were at Brookhouse at the time?
It depends which period you're talking about.
Well, the time is the relevant period for the purposes of this inquiry.
I've certainly spoken to the interim director who we put in place.
Yeah, who else?
Functional leads that were in post, not at Brookhouse, but functional leads that have a recollection of the relevant period.
And you go on in that paragraph to say this was limited to the staff members identified in the programme where processes and procedures were not followed, namely around the use of force, completing paperwork correctly, and the treating of detainees with dignity and respect. So, is it your suggestion that somehow Callum Tully, on behalf of the BBC, conveniently managed to capture the entirety of the bad practices and abuse at Brookhouse at the time, and that there was nothing more to see here? Is that what you're trying to say here? Is limited to?
What I'm saying is it is our understanding that these were isolated incidents, and I take and I make that conclusion based on information which we've have internally, but also information which was provided to the organisation from the IMB and the Home Office, etc. So I think we're not running this establishment in isolation. There are a number of third parties on site, so we are, of which I have no recollection of those parties raising these issues. So I think it's important to stress that the centre did have a number of organisations on site, both the IMB, as I said, the IMB, the Home Office, amongst others.
So does G4S accept or not accept that these practices were ingrained and systemic?
I do not accept that they were ingrained and systemic.
So from your perspective, on behalf of the company, what we are seeing are isolated instances of the abuse of detainees, all as it happens captured by Callum Tully. But for the rest, the inquiry shouldn't be concerned that that kind of abuse of that type was going on outside that period. Is that what we should understand from your evidence?
What I'm saying is we believe these to be isolated incidents, and we take a view on that from our experience from Home Office, IMB, other authorities. So we believe that they were isolated incidents. I would agree with your comment in specific relation to the isolated incidents.
No, you don't want to be agreeing with me, Mr. Brockington, because all I'm doing is putting questions to you. Don't take from anything I say that I'm vocalising an opinion. Back to your statement at page 17, paragraph 73. You talk about the complaint system. And you say, in light of the fact that the significant incidents broadcast by Panorama were not reported to senior management by detainees or staff at the time, the company has been asked to comment on whether the complaint system and or whistleblowing policy properly accounted for potential barriers to disclosure. It's also the case that none of the matters appear to have been reported by any of the other multiple organisations that were in regular contact with detainees, certainly not in a way that would have permitted G4S to take action on the report. It's not entirely clear why this is. It may, however, be a manifestation of a general lack of trust within the detained population towards agencies of the state. And at 74, the complaint system, which you explained further below, detainees had free and unfettered access to the complaint system. The company believes that the system itself was robust and transparent. The complaint system was, however, determined by the HO, in other words, the Home Office. So does the company, through you, Mr. Brockington, take comfort from the fact that at least during the relevant period, there were no official reports of mistreatment? Is that what we're to understand from what you say? We, the company, take comfort. Our whistleblowing processes were robust, our complaint system was robust, and therefore the absence of complaints means there's an absence of evidence.
Just need to be clear on the process for complaints in the establishment. The IRCs had a very different complaints process to that of the custody estate, whereas the Home Office run the complaints process for the detainees. In terms of our own complaints process and whistleblowing, we need to be very clear that we believe there was a robust process in place for staff to make complaints. But I also say in my personal statement, which you may or may not come on to, is that in this instance, it didn't work. The individuals who we witnessed on the Panorama programme chose not to use the whistleblowing process, which goes against the training which we trained through the ITC programme, and it also goes against their obligation to the Secretary of State under their certification. Yeah. So it didn't work. We took a number of actions. It didn't work because they chose not to use it. We took a number of actions post-Panorama to reinforce the whistleblowing process. The whistleblowing process, just to be clear, was a process which G4S established, working very closely with public concern at work, who are deemed to be experts in this field, and advised Bays as an example on whistleblowing processes. So we felt this was a global process which was designed by experts and implemented across our business. After Panorama, we promoted it. We promoted it heavily, part of our action plan. But of course, these things are only work if people choose to use them. Why people chose not to use them, which is contrary to their training and is contrary to their obligation to the Secretary of State under their certification, is I can't conclude as to why that happened.
So you can't account for the fact that it wasn't being used to capture and investigate the serious abuses that happened at Brookhouse during the period that we're concerned with?
What I'm saying is I can't conclude why the individuals who we witnessed on the Panorama programme chose not to use the whistleblowing process, which is in contrary to their training and contrary to their obligation to the Secretary of State under their certification.
I'll come back to a couple of reasons in a moment. Before we break, there's one further document I'd like to show you. HOM 0331707, please. Yeah, HOM 0331707. This, Mr. Brockington, is an internal memorandum within the Home Office. It's dated the 22nd of March. It should be 2018. And the name to whom it's sent is redacted, but I think I'm at liberty to tell you who the name actually is. It's Patsy Wilkinson, who was the second permanent secretary. And so this is as high up as this document went, and there is a list of other people to whom this document went at the foot of it, which probably in this version will be redacted, so we won't be able to see it. Panorama allegations against G4S staff at Brookhouse, and it's to do with a meeting at paragraph 1 to discuss professional standards unit investigations and Brookhouse on the 20th of February. They undertook to provide her with a definitive account of what the Home Office knew about the detainee custody officers against whom allegations were made in the outcome of associated investigations. Paragraph 2. There were 17 members of G4S staff identified within the material Panorama provided before the broadcast, or from the broadcast footage, details of which were provided separately. And under the heading prior allegations, of these 17, 7 had been the subject of serious complaints in 2016 and 2017 and were investigated by the PSU, and a table is provided below. These investigations were prior to and unconnected with the Panorama allegations. On the date on which we were made aware of Panorama's allegation, 24th of August, there were 6 outstanding investigations into the activities of 5 DCOs, highlighted in the table. None of the investigations were based on allegations that subsequently featured in the Panorama material. So of the 17 identified in the Panorama broadcast, 7 of them had already been the subject of serious complaint in 2016 and 2017. Were you aware of that, Mr. Brockington?
No, I wasn't.
Surely G4S must have been.
I would expect, but I can't wholly conclude. I can come back to the inquiry if that would be helpful.
Yes, please. But if it's right, whether they're allegations substantiated or unsubstantiated, they are serious. If you look down the list, they are all assaults. There are some sexual assaults, and one is assault and neglect. And we'll see that the greater number are against a DCO by the name of Derek Murphy. Do you agree that G4S should have considered these more closely before being exposed by the BBC?
I'm afraid personally I can't conclude either way on that. What I have committed to the inquiry is we will respond if that would be helpful. But I can't add anything further to your line of questioning, I'm afraid.
All right, Mr. Brockington. It's 25 past, Chair. Can I suggest a 15-minute break, coming back at 22?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Altman. Thank you.
Zainab, can we put up on screen, please, Mr. Brockington's first witness statement, CJS 0074041 at page 11. And here you are dealing with policies and procedures. Paragraph 45. You say it's evident that certain staff members, and in particular Mr. Callum Tully, did not report their concerns on abuses and or impropriety. This did put detainees at risk, as it allowed abuses of the type shown in Panorama to continue. Such abuses would have been prevented had prompt reports been made, as they would have been acted upon by the company. Mr. Tully stated in the programme that he didn't report his concerns on the basis that he didn't believe that they would have been taken seriously. The company doesn't understand the basis of this assertion, given that there was never any attempt by him to raise such concerns at any stage during his employment with the company through its whistleblowing policy or otherwise. The company is confident that had he done so, such complaints would have been treated seriously. Were you aware that Speak Out posters had been defaced in parts of Brookhouse, or a part of Brookhouse that was accessible by staff members, upon which was written words like snitch or grass? Did you know that?
I did know that.
So anybody reading that would understand pretty readily that speaking out, even within the company's global whistleblowing policy, would be met by a difficulty, to say the least, amongst one's colleagues. Do you agree?
I think there were a couple of posters that were defaced in that way, which is not acceptable. So I would say that it's not acceptable to have that on the posters.
And Callum Tully joined the company, if my memory serves me, in 2015 when he was 18. So by the time we're talking about, he was a young man of around 20. And ironically, as you probably realise, Mr. Brockington, he was influenced to go to the BBC Panorama production team, having watched on the 12th of January 2016 the Panorama expose into Medway.
I was aware of
But he was
that point.
He was a 20-year-old or thereabouts. But Owen Syred, he wasn't. You've heard the name Owen Syred.
I have.
And if we put up on screen what he told us in his witness statement, please, INAB INN 000007 at page 30. He was a mature man, a welfare officer, respected, listened to, and under the heading in his statement, disciplinary and grievance process, between paragraphs 125 and 127, he tells the story of how someone by the name of Sam Gurney said to him, you can see about half a dozen lines up, when some of the detainees were being demanding, "I bloody hate this lot, no wonder I'm racist." And he made some comment about that. A couple of weeks later, he was in the wing office on C Wing, talking to another DCO by the name of Liam Sharkey, who was eating a packet of plantain crisps. And he says, I asked Liam what they were, and Sam interjected and said, "They are crisps for niggers." I couldn't believe what he had said. I knew I had to challenge the comment, didn't want to do it in front of detainees, so 2 points. First of all, Gurney says what he says. Mr. Syred very sensibly did not want to challenge the comment in front of detainees because, as he said, this could have caused disruption. A detainee was stood nearby, and I wasn't sure if he'd heard everything that had been said. The detainee said to me, "Did I hear what I thought I heard?" And he said, I told the detainee I would deal with it, and the detainee said, I trust you to deal with it. And so he did. He went to Conway Edwards, who was the, I think, a diversity and inclusion manager, and took the complaint there. And at paragraph 127, following my report of this incident, I started to receive post-it notes stuck on my locker that said nigger lover and grass. And for about a year afterwards, friends of Sam in the control room would follow me around by camera and raise bogus reports to try and get me into trouble. For example, a complaint that I'd shaved in the barber's while on duty, which was false. I was also told by a colleague to watch my back and that people had it in for me because I'd reported Sam. I reported this behaviour to the director, Ben Saunders, and recommended that future recruitment should focus on more mature candidates. If this sort of thing happened to somebody of the seniority of Owen Syred, what confidence could anybody have that whistleblowing would make any difference other than one which was to the detriment of the person who made the complaint?
Clearly that sort of behaviour is horrendous. And I would absolutely not accept that behaviour in the estate, in the establishments which I'm currently responsible for.
And what's the answer to the question, Mr. Brockington?
You would conclude that clearly, on a personal level, and it's my personal view in response to that question, that younger men, clearly Callum Tully was influenced by this, and he made it clear in his statement.
Well, my question was, what confidence could anybody have in making a complaint to the whistleblowing through the whistleblowing hotline or process if the result is nothing other than detriment to the person who makes the complaint? That's my question. And the answer is surely none, isn't it?
We were very clear in our training through the ITCs and promoting the ITCs that individuals should use the Speak Out, and they should absolutely, in accordance with their obligation under their certification to the Secretary of State, and they have an obligation to raise any concerns. So I, to be honest, I can't conclude either way. What I can say is we trained our staff to speak out when they found areas of concern, either through line management, which would be our primary option, or by whistleblowing if they chose not to use the line management reporting process. So, and we emphasised that further after Panorama. So it was, they had an obligation to us under their training. They had an obligation to the Secretary of State as well.
Which is all fine and dandy, Mr. Brockington, but you talk about reporting to line managers if you don't want to use the formal hotline. Well, because Callum Tully was a DCO, his line managers were DCMs, and he made it perfectly clear to us when he gave evidence in the first phase of this inquiry that the principal reason he reported none of this to other DCMs was because the DCMs were involved in it themselves. That's a fair point, isn't it?
I can't comment on what was happening on site at the time. What I can say is that the organisation which I'm managing director of and I'm responsible for, I believe, has a culture where if those feel they can't report to their line management, they can escalate that, and I'm very clear that anybody can escalate any issues to myself. So whilst I can't comment on during this period at the IRC, what I can say is that is certainly the culture which I have in my organisation.
Owen Syred talks about the culture at paragraph 129, which is still on screen. The culture within the organisation was that they didn't want to make waves and didn't want to generate publicity. Was that right, Mr. Brockington?
As I said in my previous statement, I can't comment for at that point in time, at that establishment, what I can say is that is certainly not an environment in which I recognise in the establishments and the business which I currently run.
If we go to what Callum Tully had to say in his inquiry witness statement, INQ 000052 at page 42, paragraph 168. Let's start at 167. In the majority of examples outlined in this statement, members of staff were present during mistreatment of detainees and for admissions of abuse and malpractice who were otherwise well-behaving officers. This underlines the lack of confidence staff had in raising complaints about such behaviour. And at 168, this culture of silence across the workforce of Brookhouse, coupled with a lack of demonstrable oversight, interest and engagement from Ben Saunders and his senior management team, allowed the abusive culture in Brookhouse to fester and go unchecked. The confidence that officers and managers had to, in front of other members of staff, flagrantly brag and joke about abuse or speak in derogatory or even racist terms about detainees demonstrated their faith in the culture of silence which allowed the abuse to persist. Do you want to disagree with that?
What I would say to that point is we operated the site, but not in a silo. We operated the site with on-site engagement from the Home Office and IMB, amongst others. And this was not raised to, is my understanding, is not raised to the IMB, the Home Office, or ourselves during that period. So, so that is what I conclude from that. Clearly, this statement shows a culture of silence, but I wasn't privy to the site at the time, and so I'd be surmising to more conclusively respond to your question. But I do stand by what I say in terms of we were on site with the IMB and the Home Office, and to my understanding, it wasn't raised to them either.
Yeah, because it was a culture of silence. That's the whole point, isn't it, Mr. Brockington?
As I said, I can't conclude. I would be surmising.
Let's turn to another paragraph of yours, please, in your first witness statement. Back to that, please. I now say CJS 007441 at page 35, paragraph 173. All use of force incidents were reported directly to the Home Office as required under the terms of the contract. Do you want to rethink that sentence, Mr. Brockington? Is there anything about it that's not accurate, do you think?
That is my understanding when I submitted the statement to the inquiry.
Well, what about the incident which resulted in the strangulation of D1527 on the 25th of April, when there was a failure by anyone to bring to anyone's attention that assault on him on that date, let alone forget the Home Office, let alone to G4S? It's not right, is it, this sentence? You know what I'm talking about, don't you?
Of course I do.
Yeah. There was a complete cover-up which involved every officer who was involved in the illegitimate use of force on D1527 in room 7 of E-Wing at around 7 o'clock in the evening on the 25th of April of 2017. Callum Tully tells us, and we have it on transcript and on video, that after it happened, Jan Pashali, who was the principal involved in this, told Callum Tully, as it stands, no use of force. In other words, no report was to be compiled. And as you may know if you have followed the evidence, Jan Pashali claims that he did complete an incident report for the final of the three aspects of the incident with D1527 on the 25th of April, left it on a desk by a pigeonhole, but somehow magically it disappeared, and his claim to this inquiry at the beginning of this set of hearings was that Callum Tully had, for reasons of his own, made it disappear. In the end, there wasn't a single report that he had been strangled on that evening by Jan Pashali, let alone that Pashali had whispered to him, "You fucking piece of shit, because I'm going to put you to fucking sleep." Now, when you think about all of that, how does it come about, Mr. Brockington, that at paragraph 173 of your corporate statement, you tell this inquiry in a witness statement said to be a statement of truth that all use of force incidents were reported directly to the Home Office as required under the terms of the contract?
The reports were made. I would expect the reports to be made. In all honesty, I can't comment further on what we've said. I understand the point that you've made.
Yeah, it's wrong, isn't it?
I understand the point that you've made.
It's wrong, isn't it?
In that instance, that incident wasn't reported.
The sentence is wrong, isn't it?
I would agree.
Thank you. You see, if Callum Tully, who you criticise, hadn't filmed the event, no one would be any the wiser, would they?
For those specific incidents, they weren't. The reports, for whatever reason, weren't filed.
Do you not think, just standing back for a second, Mr. Brockington, that in singling out Callum Tully, as you do in your witness statement, for criticism, in fact, the only person who, in fact, did anything about the abuse on that day, and other abuses, not just that, but this one in particular, rather than any member of staff or management of G4S, don't you think this continues to send out a signal as to how snitches or grasses will be treated by the company?
My response is we would expect all frontline officers, in fact all staff who have completed the ITC, to report incidents such as this. Perhaps an oversight to single out Callum Tully. He was one of a number of individuals who were present, who witnessed these abhorrent activities, and all of the staff who witnessed that have an obligation to us under the training which we deploy and to the Secretary of State under the terms of their certification to report such incidents. All of them failed to do so.
Let me ask you a few things about what you say on the subject of the use of force. But before I do, have you read John Collier's reports on use of force made to this inquiry? He gave evidence yesterday. But have you read his report?
I haven't read his report, no.
Why not?
I haven't read his report.
Why not?
Others have. I haven't.
Well, others, fine. Many others in this room have. Why didn't you?
I just haven't read the report.
No, we know that. You've said that 3 times. Why not? You knew about them, presumably.
I did. I
Yeah.
just haven't read them.
So why didn't you?
I just haven't read the report, I'm afraid.
Did you appreciate that he identified 27 incidents of the use of force during the relevant period, which to him were incidents of significant concern in various ways, in that they either involved an excess of the use of force, they were wholly disproportionate, or that they were provoking or punitive in nature, in other words, to punish the detainee. Were you even aware of that?
I wasn't cited on that.
Well, now you are. What do you think about it?
All our frontline officers are trained to deliver CNR, and we, at the time, also did annual refresher training. So I would expect, and certainly in the establishments where that I currently run, we have very clear governance around the deployment of CNR, reviews, feedback, what was happening at the time. I can't comment on what I can comment on is what we currently have in place, and I have full confidence in my very experienced leadership teams that we have governance structures in place to measure and monitor CNR.
Well, presumably if you sat here in July 2017, you'd have said, I have full confidence in my senior, experienced leadership team. Presumably you wouldn't have had that level of confidence had you sat here in July 2017, knowing what we now know.
I would be speculating to answer that.
Yeah. You deal with a particular issue which you seem to have taken exception about, paragraph 184 of your witness statement on page 37. The inquiry has stated that it seems that many of the reports of injury to detainee F213 forms attached to use of force forms were left blank, or such forms were not attached to the use of force forms. The company doesn't accept that many of the forms were left blank. The F213 is a general document used to record all injuries to detainees, however they are sustained. It's not specifically designed for use of force incident reporting. It's a separate standalone document which was adopted into the use of force packs. Did you realise, Mr. Brockington, that out of 106 use of force incidents where we have the documentation, 62 F213s are incomplete or missing? And I can break that down for you. 28 of them were missing, so that's almost 50%. None were left totally blank, but in 28 reports, the reporting officer did not fill out section 2s, which are the details and the description of the incident, and 7 reports were missing the second page, which contains the medical assessment. And one of that number falls within 2 categories. In other words, section 2 was not completed and the second page was missing. As to why they were missing, do you not agree that all documents were preserved or should have been preserved? What's your understanding of the documentation from the period?
My view is that...
Not your view. I don't want your view. I want what the facts are, Mr. Brockington.
I can't conclude what happened at the time. I'd be surmising. But what we have said in my statement is there were areas which were missing.
You'll agree with this, I hope, that all documents should have been preserved. Do you accept that much?
Yes, I do.
There was a police investigation after all, which started fairly swiftly.
Correct.
Lampard started when? Around November 2017?
That's broadly my recollection, yes.
Then there was a judicial review brought by 2 of the formerly detained people, which started in January 2018. So all the documentation should have been preserved. Have you any explanation for why it hasn't been?
I don't.
At your paragraph 186, which is still up on screen, you say it's acknowledged that on some of the F213 forms, sections 1 to 3 were not always completed. However, the information asked was duplicative of the information already set out and provided in the preceding DCF2 documentation. This information is not therefore missing from the pack. Are you saying it didn't really have a separate purpose? What's the use of the word duplicative mean?
No, what I'm saying in that statement is certain areas were duplicated in the F213 and the DCF2, and that might be one reason for them not being completed correctly.
Well, let's just. I'm going to put up an example just so everybody can see what I'm talking about. And what you were talking about here in the witness statement. Can we put up, please, Zainab, CJS 005534, start at page 1. And this happens to be in relation to D1527 for the 25th of April, but this is the first part of, in effect, a three-part incident. You can see the time use of force commenced, according to this document, 1909, and completed at 10 minutes past. And if we go on, please, to page 5, here we see a document which apparently was completed by Joe Buss, who was the nurse, headed injuries sustained and healthcare involvement. And within the box, an F213 or equivalent form was completed by, it says name Joe Buss. Did the detainee sustain any injuries at the time? And yes is checked. Can we go on, please, to page 7? Here we find the Annex A statement of Steve Lawton, a DCM who went to D1527's aid when he was alerted to the fact by a DCO that he had put a ligature around his neck. And if we can go to the next page, we can see the narrative. At approximately 1908, I was checking the daily food refusals, and I was on Eden Wing. I was just about to check a detainee by the name of, who was currently on a constant supervision and Rule 40 and was residing in room E7. I was told by the officer who was watching him, DCO Fraser, that he had just gone into the toilet area and he couldn't see him properly. I entered the room and called his name but had no answer. I then went into the toilet area, which is where I saw 1527 curled up around the toilet area with what looked like a ripped t-shirt around his neck, which he was holding on to. I attempted to loose the ligature, but 1527 was holding on to it. So I asked DCO Fraser to pass me his fish knife, and I managed to cut the ligature off. I then pulled 1527 out of the toilet area and asked him to sit on the bed, which he did, and I called for medical assistance on my radio. So all we have so far, would you agree, Mr. Brockington, is a narrative account from Lawton which says nothing about any injury. We have a checkbox ticked which said that the detainee did suffer injury but no detail. Do you agree so far?
I would agree so far.
Right. And if we go, please, to page 11. Actually, back to page 10, sorry. Here's the report of injury today to detainee. This is the F213. Surname, ciphered as 1527. Section 2A, time and date of incident, 25th of April 17 at 1900 hours. The rest is not completed. Section 2B, brief report of circumstances in which injury was sustained, to be completed by the incident reporting officer, completely blank. Can you just scroll down, Zainab, please? You agree? Nothing there?
I would agree, there's nothing there, yeah.
And then on the next page, section 3, healthcare report to be completed by medical staff, seen on E-Wing, room by RGN, I think it is, Joe, and that must be Joe Buss. Detainee had placed a ligature around his neck, removed by staff. After that, he went to toilet and attempted to self-strangulate. Something removed from his neck. Slight redness noted on his neck. And there we see, if we scroll down a little more, an indicator around his neck, slight redness on his neck. Let's just scroll back up. What this document doesn't tell you is how the redness noted on his neck arose. Because first of all, it refers to a ligature, and then it refers to an attempt to self-strangulate. And the order of events here are important, Mr. Brockington, because the first of this three-part incident was the ligature, when indeed Steve Lawton went in, being alerted to the fact that he was trying to strangulate himself with a ligature and remove the ligature with a fish knife. Matters then calmed down when he placed in or around his mouth a battery from a mobile phone. Were you appreciative of that?
I was, yeah.
That's the
Well,
second.
I was appreciative of the evidence that was given in relation to that point.
And then, as you'll know, the third part of the incident is when he attempted to self-strangulate with his hands. And I think reading this then, probably the last words on that third line are hands removed from his neck. What this doesn't tell us is what Jan Pashali did. Do you agree?
I would agree, yes.
What this doesn't tell us is the whole series of events that led to Jan Pashali doing as he did, or for that matter, saying what he did. Do you agree?
I do agree with that.
And
yes.
then if you read this at face value, slight redness noted on his neck, you would have no idea, minor injuries though they may be, you would have no idea whether those injuries might have been caused by Jan Pashali digging his thumbs into his neck. Would you?
I agree with what you're saying. I do.
And this is part of the cover-up that I was suggesting to you a little earlier. Let me ask you now, please, something about your interview with Kate Lampard. Please, can we put up on screen VER 000255? This is your interview on the 9th of March 2018. Was it just Kate Lampard or both her and Ed Marsden?
It is her and Ed.
If we go to page 10. You say at 121, and I'm just picking out the numbers in the left-hand margin, you're talking about contracts, and you say towards the end of that passage, rest assured, the vast majority of government tendering, regardless of whether it says it's 50-50 price quality, it's price. Let's face facts. Are you talking about what the focal point of any government contract in this environment is?
No, I need to be really clear on this. If I can just explain the tendering process, if it might be helpful for the inquiry. When a organisation, a customer, whether it be private sector or public sector, but in this instance public sector, the Home Office want to reissue a service and they look to outsource, they issue an invitation to tender. An invitation to tender is a set of criteria and requirements that in this instance the private sector would then, us and competitors would respond to. When they set out that criteria and list of requirements, they also set out the contract, they set out KPIs, KPTs, they also set out how it's going to be measured, i.e. is it going to be measured on the quality submission, which is how we're going to do this, or is it going to be measured on the price, i.e. what price we're going to deliver it for. What I can say, harping back to probably 2007, I think there was a far bigger drive by government to get a low price, which I would argue isn't necessarily value for money. I think that's a very, very different question. So the 50-50 ratio, which I refer to, is when they score the contract, they're scoring it half on the quality of our solution and half on the price which we are prepared to deliver it for. So in that, what I was saying is different organisations apply different weightings to quality or price. Now, whilst in 2007, I believe the general thrust from government was to get a cheaper price. What I can say is that has demonstrably changed since that period, and there is a far bigger drive by government for value for money and quality.
Yeah, but therein lies the flaw with the contract under which G4S operated, Brookhouse, during the period, because the focal point was on price rather than welfare, wasn't it?
So I think a couple of points on that. It was a contract which, yes, we ended up delivering, but we lost at the tender process to GSL. And of course, we inherited the contract through the acquisition. And it is set by government. It is set by the customer. Their list of requirements, their list of measurements, and the ratio, how they decide to score it. So I think that's probably quite clear.
Except this, I mean, we don't perhaps put it up on screen now, but you will have seen a series of presentation documents which were created, I think, by Mr. Schoenenberger, who was or became the head of the DEPMU in due course. And do you remember reading, for the record, Chair, but I'm going to deal with this through another witness, DL 000140 at page 47. The Home Office's own internal assessment of the bids said, and you'll remember this, an ethos of cutting corners and meeting basic standards was evident from much of what we have read, and we're especially disappointed at the extended lockdown hours proposed by these 4 bidders. This appears to be a desperate attempt to reduce costs at the expense of welfare. GSL was one of the 4 bidders, wasn't it?
It was,
Yeah.
my understanding, yeah. In fact, they won it.
They did, and therefore it's not just about the Home Office, because all 4 companies, including GSL, were cutting corners in order to win the contract, weren't they?
I can't comment. I can't comment on the submission of a competitor at the time. What I can say is, and the process for tendering is the authority, the Home Office in this case, sets out the criteria, and the private sector in this case responds with a solution which needs to be sustainable on a number of metrics.
Yeah. And it wasn't just GSL. I mean, G4S bid for the contract as well. And so you were one of the 4 bidders who the assessor was complaining about trying to cut corners.
I really can't comment on something back in 2007.
You've seen the documents, haven't you?
The tender documents?
Yes.
The specific tender documents, well, I haven't seen the specific tender documents because it goes back to 2007.
You haven't looked at them because they were in your pack. Have you not looked at them?
Not in detail.
Any detail by the sound of it, no. So coming back to your interview with Verita, which is still up on screen, if we look down the page, please, at 125, Mr. Marsden is continuing in trading reviews. I think the financials come first. You say no, never. Health and safety always comes first. Okay, that's interesting, he says. Someone told me that. And you say never. And at the top of the next page, interesting, he says, you say agenda point 1 on every XCOM is health and safety. Just explain what XCOM is, will you?
It's the executive committee.
Yeah. And what does the executive committee of G4S do? What's its raison d'etre?
At the specific time was to manage the regional business.
Yeah. And if we move on, please, to page 18. Says the questioner at 241, who may be Kate Lampard, can I just ask you about the chain of reporting on all of this? You've described how trading reviews focus on this matrix, balanced scorecard, all that sort of thing. And then it gets up to XCOM, and XCOM will drill down if there are evident things that are out of kilter and look absurd. By the time it gets to the board, one question Ashley asked us is, you have HMIP reporting, you've local IMB reporting, you have trading reviews. Why did nobody tell him that people were behaving like brutes in Brookhouse? There are indicators for that, aren't there? I can't write a thesis on what the line is, but understaffed place, staff under pressure, not enough managers, not enough time off, not enough training and development, all of that stuff. What's your answer as to why that didn't come through to your board? And you answer, clearly something isn't working. And then you say, we have whistleblowing. And you're asked, is that something that's on the metrics too? On the formal reporting, yes, I don't see that, but Peter sees every single whistleblowing. That's Peter Needham, presumably.
Yes.
Who's the Ashley?
Chief Exec.
What wasn't working, do you think? What were you telling Verita wasn't working?
What I was saying, in what I was trying to get across, and it appears quite clumsy, was the way that the trading reports, what were called, you've heard of different names for this through the inquiry. I heard them called trading reports. I've heard them called business reports. I personally call them performance reports because they are absolutely, I think trading builds a picture of just commercial view. These were absolutely not that. These were business reviews where we looked at all aspects of health and safety, but I include use of force, I include violence on detainee or violence on prisoner in my current business, self-harm, recruitment, HR, the list goes on to cover all aspects of the business, and we also, at the end, we cover facilities management as an example, and then onto commercials. So these are full business reviews, and I stand by. In my current business, what I review with a very high level of scrutiny and governance on a monthly basis with the sites is all these areas. So I stand by what I say, that the whistleblowing process, I think Peter did say in his evidence that he did see the whistleblowing reports.
At page 12, at 148, you're asked, I suppose, what I'm asking is not so much the actual mechanics of whether or not they've breached a fundamental agreement, it's what sort of pressure are they put under to perform better than that board agreed sum. Do you rate your directors one against the other on how much more they're able to get out of a contract? You say categorically not. We don't rate them one against one. We apply measured commercial pressure to them to deliver a number of components of their contract. If you look at it in terms of, this is all a bit nonsensy, if you look at it in terms of a balanced scorecard, we measure them on their health and safety performance, we measure them on their profitability, we measure them on their KPIs. These are all linked together. So if you fail your KPIs, you're probably going to get financial penalties, which probably means your profitability is going to go down. The other really important thing about that is they're all leading indicators. So if you have a safe contract and your team are engaged and you're not hurting people and you're delivering all those lead indicators such as health and safety, the chances are your profitability isn't going to be as good as well, because you're running a really good contract, you're a really good management team. We measure lead indicators which ultimately drive profitability. It is one component of a few, all of which are linked, but clearly we want them to make more money, not to the detriment of all the other indicators. And then I'm just picking up on a few themes here, Mr. Brockington, at line 157 at the bottom. You're asked, but your recollection of the contract was that it was not financially troublesome. You say, no, correct. You also agree on page 14, if we go over to page 14 at the top at 170, where you're asked, I suppose what I'm really asking you is if you have any experience of the sort of pressure that person from the Home Office who sits on the ground at Gatwick and is the interface between the Home Office and the operation, if your experience is, as ours is, that really the thing they are focused on is pleasing the masters about people in and people out. And we've got the local person to admit that that's the case. Does that accord with your experience? And you say, yes, I think so. I think they will be driving what their boss is interested in. And so let me ask you, against the background of those questions and answers, and I'm asking this on behalf of several of the core participants in this inquiry, Mr. Brockington. Do you accept that in order for this model of performance monitoring to work, it's essential that the KPIs and the imposition of financial penalties imposed on you by whoever purchases G4S's services takes account of detainee welfare?
As I explained, or tried to explain in my previous comments around the tender process, the customer, the Home Office in this case, puts out to the market a list of requirements in the invitation to tender. Included in that is their requirements, their what they want to achieve, their strategic objectives, but also that includes, more often than not, a list of key performance indicators. These are designed by the customer, and we respond to those in their tender. So I'm afraid, whilst I don't want to appear to be skirting this, because I'm absolutely not. This is, in all instances that I've been, for many years, been engaged with procurement in the public sector, the KPTs and KPIs, whatever you choose to call them, are designed and established and set out by the customer, and we respond and we build a sustainable model and service delivery model to respond, to ensure we deliver a service as required by the customer, and we also ensure our adherence to the specific KPT measures.
Secondly, do you accept that it is also essential for the Home Office to insist on adequate financial penalties to ensure that there is sufficient impact on your profitability to incentivise the centre director to take action?
In my experience over, I say, a significant number of years bidding for work within the public sector, KPTs are one measure that the authority measures us against. The financial penalties vary between organisations, and the application of the quantum varies depending on KPT and depending on customers. So again, it's back to, I'm afraid, it's back to the Home Office. They set the criteria in terms of what is to be measured, and the financial penalty regime which sits alongside that.
Who's ultimately responsible here, Mr. Brockington, for what happened?
In terms of
the abuse, who do you think is ultimately responsible?
As an organisation, and in the organisation which I am responsible for, in terms of our care and rehabilitation business, if this was to happen in the business that I run today, I would be responsible.
Yeah. Who was responsible, in your view, for what happened between April and at the end of August 2017?
I believe the individuals who, to be honest, I can't conclude either way. What I can say, because I can't conclude for that point in time, what I can say is for the business that I run, I would hold myself responsible if this was to happen in my business.
Yeah. Well, that's that's terrific, because we're not asking you about what's going on now. I'm asking you about what happened in the spring to the summer of 2017. Now, you've not come here, Mr. Brockington, without having some understanding of what G4S's position is on this. And are you telling us that you have no position to state publicly about whether G4S holds its hands up, as it were, and accepts its responsibility, not perhaps full responsibility, but in part its responsibility for what happened during those months.
I would accept we hold a degree of responsibility.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Because for one moment it sounded like you weren't prepared to accept even that much.
If that is what has come across the inquiry, that is wrong. I have said, as an organisation and as an individual, responsible for this business now, I would hold myself wholly responsible and for these abhorrent behaviours. I couldn't be clearer on that. I think the inquiry will, of course, deliver the findings of the inquiry based on the evidence that has been given. But I hope I'm very clear in my openness to the inquiry around the fact that we take these matters incredibly seriously, have actioned a significant amount of all the areas covered, and we will continue to do so and continue to within the prison environment now, clearly not the detained environment, because we no longer operate with that environment. But I hope my position is now clear.
A couple of final topics for you, Mr. Brockington. First of all, can we go back to your witness statement at paragraph 182, which is on page 36. It's up on screen. You say, following a use of force event, detainees would sometimes have been relocated to the CSU if deemed appropriate, usually as a result of continued aggressive behaviour to staff or others. Removal was therefore either for their protection or that of others. And you go on to say at 183, the suicide and prevention of self-harm policy would have been followed in CSU where appropriate, although this wouldn't impact upon the use of force event itself. And then if we can go forwards, please, to paragraph 200, which we find on page 40. And I want to go really to the end of that paragraph, which is on page 41 at the top. A number of detainees were also struggling to adapt to detention, and several spent prolonged periods on Rule 40, awaiting transfer to mental health facilities or to the prison estate. Do you accept, from everything you know, Mr. Brockington, that vulnerable detainees who were suffering from serious illness or self-harming risk were routinely relocated to the CSU under Rule 40 during the period?
What I would say is where Rule 40 occurred, and Rule 42, talking about Rule 40, there was a very different process for, or sometimes, arguably a different process, and planned and unplanned. In the event of a planned use of Rule 40, there would be pre-authorisation by the Secretary of State's representative. In an unplanned use of Rule 40, the duty manager, and we would call that a case of urgency, the duty manager could authorise initially the Rule 40 and then be followed up immediately, pretty much immediately, by the authority representative from the Secretary of State. So when we used Rule 40 and Rule 42, it was within full sight of and authorisation of the Secretary of State's representative within the Home Office. And that was also, I've referred on a few occasions to us not working in isolation at the Immigration Removal Centre, because of course we reported the use of these to the Home Office on a daily basis at the 0800 meeting, daily reports, weekly reports, and also to the IMB. So what we did in those circumstances was fully authorised by the Home Office on
No. And did you not realise that in a huge amount of cases, it was DCMs themselves who were authorising in cases of urgency? Did you know that?
It was our view that the duty manager would authorise.
I know what it was your view. But what I'm asking you is whether you knew DCMs were, in fact, giving authorisation.
I didn't know that. I wasn't around at the time. So
well, is this news to you now? Have you not heard this before?
no. I'm aware.
You are aware. So what do you think about it?
My understanding is I can't comment fully on anything further, but what I can say is the authorisation was followed up by the Home Office's authorisation.
So are you prepared to accept that the use of the Rule 40 mechanism for relocating vulnerable detainees to the CSU, those suffering from serious illness or were at risk of self-harm, their routine relocation was inappropriate to manage their mental health? Do you accept that?
I can't conclude either way.
Or is it you're just not prepared to?
It's not that I'm not prepared to. I can't conclude. I have no detailed knowledge of it.
Finally, a question on occupancy. You know that Brookhouse was built to the specification of a Category B prison.
I do.
Albeit without the sort of activities a Category prison would or should have, holding prisoners who were serving perhaps relatively short-term sentences. This was a building, we understand, which was designed for short-term holding of up to 72 hours, but unfortunately, if that was the intention, it was never or rarely complied with. You know that?
I was fully aware of that, yes.
Yeah. The HMIP report for Tinsley House in 2018 confirms that Tinsley House was closed for refurbishment between September 2016 and May 2017. Presumably you know that.
I do.
And a number of staff was transferred over to Brookhouse at the time. Appreciate that too.
I do appreciate that.
Yeah. In your second witness statement, paragraph 9, we don't need to put it up perhaps, but you say this: I was not involved in any discussions around this matter, and the matter you refer to is the heading Increase in Operational Capacity. But on the 25th of January 2017, you say the Home Office issued a formal change request to CJS, which is Custodial and Justice Services.
At the time,
Yeah, that's what part of the moniker of the company or the division.
it was part of a division of G4S.
Requiring it to increase the operation capacity at Brookhouse from 448 to 508. This was then effected through a contractual change notice from the Home Office on the 27th of January 2017. We know that. We don't have to put up the documents, but we've seen two documents in that regard. For the record, CJS 0074084, which is the service provider request form, dated the 25th of January, signed off, although it's draft, but with Jerry Petherick's name on it for the extra 60 beds. And the Home Office Notice of Change document dated the 27th of January is HOM 000859. And the idea was that these beds would be operational with effect from the 1st of April 2017. The extra 60 beds, although we understand they may have been in place or built at least by the end of 2016. Now, given that most of the Tinsley House staff were working at Brookhouse from around September 2016 onwards until their return there back from Brookhouse, are you able to say whether or not there were staff shortages at Brookhouse in the period from around September 2016 to, give or take, November, December 2016, the time after HMIP had completed their inspection?
So my understanding is we delivered to the contractual requirements as set out in the contract in terms of resourcing at that time.
So the answer is, what, you don't know, or you can't say, or there were no staff shortages?
What I'm saying is we fulfilled our contract.
But what does that mean?
So there's a minimum staffing level set out in the contract, and we were broadly compliant to the terms of that contract.
Well, let me ask it another way. Do you know whether G4S incurred any contractual penalties in that period for failing to meet the minimum staffing requirements? What are you referring to there, Mr. Brockington? I see you've got something in the witness box with you. Is it an aide-memoire of some kind?
I've just got a couple of notes.
Well, it looks like a lot of notes from where I'm
It's
standing.
just a couple of notes to help me answer your questions fully.
Right.
I can't confirm. I will make a response to the inquiry to cover that point.
Well, can you add this to it? How did staffing levels in the period, say from about September to December 2016, compare to staffing levels during the relevant period? Are you able to help us with that?
Of course, we'd be delighted to.
Let's just put up on the screen, please, I think finally, the HMIP report. Again, CJS 000761 at page 5. If we look at the penultimate paragraph on the screen, this report makes a number of detailed recommendations about the treatment of detainees and the conditions in which they're held. I would add a cautionary note on an issue that is not the subject of a specific recommendation, but has the potential to adversely affect the conditions in which some detainees are held. The proposal to bring into use the third bed, which has been installed in 60 of the two-person cells. Many staff and detainees were of the view that this would lead to a decline in living standards. This is a view shared by inspectors. What did the company do about that?
My understanding of the process at the time, we worked closely with the customer. My understanding is the initial view was we wanted the Home Office wanted to increase the numbers by more than 60. We worked collaboratively with the customer to agree 60. A risk assessment was done at the time, and it was concluded, albeit I wasn't privy to those conversations, so I can't comment further. It was concluded by the site team at the time that 60, with the Home Office, that 60 would be appropriate. I'm afraid I can't comment further because I wasn't privy to further conversations.
In a moment, I'm going to invite the Chair to see if she has any questions for you, Mr. Brockington. But before I do, I'm going to invite you to consider whether there is anything you want to say to the detainees, not only those who have given live evidence before this inquiry, but those who weren't able to, those whose statements and other material was adduced before the inquiry, in respect of the mistreatment, physical and verbal, that was meted out to them during the course of the relevant period.
And I would like to take this opportunity on behalf of G4S to apologise for those who suffered mistreatment as witnessed in the Panorama programme. What we saw on the Panorama programme was, as I said previously, abhorrent behaviour. We believe it to be isolated, and we look forward to receiving the conclusions of the inquiry.
Chair.
Thank you. I have no questions. Thank you very much for your evidence, Mr. Brockington. Thank you.
Right. Chair, it's 1:45. Rather than start the next witness, can I suggest we have an early lunch and return in an hour at 1:45?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brockington. Thank you.
All rise.